what did you do in revenue in 2023?
600, somewhere in there.
So you more than doubled the business, right? In 2024, let's tease people a little bit because we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But in 2024, what were your sales in 2024?
Did right at 1.225 million, somewhere in there.
This gentleman's name is Mike Barmashi. So welcome, Mike. Thank you for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, awesome. Listen, give everybody a quick background, kind of what you do, where you're from. But before we do that, I just want to tee this up for everybody really quick. Mike grew his freight brokerage starting with no experience to over 7 figures in just his first few years. And one of the ways he did that was part-time. So he had to pursue this business part-time, and he's going to kind of tell that story. So if you're considering doing something part-time because you can't fully commit full-time for whatever reason that is, you're definitely going to want to lean in. We're going to dive into some of that today. So Mike, quick intro, give us a 30-second intro, and then we'll jump into some cool stuff to try to help some of the people in the audience.
Sure. So full-time freight broker, student of Dennis's freight broker boot camp and the sales accelerator later on, once I kind of knew the business was going to stick as well. I'm out of Waxhaw, North Carolina, mostly do anything open deck, basically machines, farm equipment, construction equipment, attachments, less than truckloads to full truckloads, oversized, overweight.
Love it. Perfect. So when did you start the business? What year did you officially start the business, get your MC? When was that?
So it was 2021 to 2022. 21, I kind of did the admin stuff, as in setting up the LLC, seeing what was going to need to be to make it official. 2022 is when I officially established my MC of January of 22. I had an action plan as far as who I was going to call, kind of how I was going to hit the ground running. And that's when I actually opened up shop and started making cold calls and reaching out, offering the service.
Okay, so let's take a quick step back. What initially attracted you to the freight brokerage industry? Because I'll be honest with you, I had no clue that it even existed. I mean, I knew the trucking industry existed. I knew the concept of logistics and supply chain, but I didn't know this little niche of freight brokerage, how it works. So how did you get introduced to that? What interested you most about it?
Same thing with me. Had no idea it existed. I always just kind of assumed that companies own their own trucks, or I didn't really give it much consideration. I was working a construction job and they had trucks and trailers with drivers, and I would help load those trucks and trailers. And in the yard, talking to the drivers, they had talked about dealing with brokers and just kind of the business on that end of it when they weren't moving the other items that were in the yard. And that sparked my curiosity, where I wanted to have my own business before. So did some Googling, looking around, and found your content, found out what it was. And that's kind of what sparked my interest and made me pursue it further.
Gotcha. Okay. So you did some of the administrative stuff in late 2021, and early in 2022, you launched, right? So you said you had a plan, right? So what was that plan initially, and how did that transpire? How did that kind of navigate the first 6 to 12 months of that business? How did that go?
Sure. So the first 3 months was fine, I guess. I was motivated. I had a bunch of different shippers off of the Freight Broker Bootcamp. You have the shipper list that's in there. I had scoured that. I had scoured Google for the industry I was going to go after was steel or metal, that kind of stuff. So that was initially where I had started. Did not have a lot of good traction beginning with, as in I could connect with people. I would get some jump ball freight, as you call it, where I was able to bid on some things. I just didn't have a lot of success, as far as there's a lot of pieces that go into it. You got to connect with the shipper. You got to be able to provide the rate. Then you got to have the rate accepted, which that's the hardest part, obviously, but I didn't have a lot of traction with that. So I started looking at other things, being the equipment, like I was familiar with from the construction side, started getting a little bit of traction with that, but honestly, it not enough to pay the bills. So I had to go back to work after first quarter, second quarter, somewhere in there, part-time, continued to pursue reaching out to shippers and trying to get in touch with people while I was working full-time, doing the brokerage part-time. And then toward the end of that year is when I got a little bit more traction, to the point where I was thinking, okay, maybe I can still make this work and keep pushing, which is when it rolled into the following calendar year.
All right, so let's pull that apart a little bit, because I think this is the really interesting part. And I think that a lot of people need to hear and understand. If I heard you correctly, you started out at the beginning of 2022 and you went all in. You were doing it full time. You were doing this 10, 12, 14 hours a day. You got a little bit of traction, but not enough to keep the wolves away. Bills got to come in, mortgages got to get paid, kids need to go get braces, all the stuff that everybody needs to do. So you ended up having to go back to work and do this part-time.
Correct.
That was after Q1. How long did you do it part-time before you ended up feeling confident enough to go full-time again?
About a year. I mean, toward the end of 2022, had some business. There's with the falling into the equipment thing. There's construction season, obviously, which is usually summertime. So I had a good 2022. I say good. It was relatively successful to the point where I would consider jumping full time. But then things kind of fell off in the wintertime like they would, just with it being a little bit seasonal, relatively speaking. And then the calendar flipped to 2023, had an okay first quarter. And then I realized that with things going to be ticking up, that I needed to put all my undivided attention into that I wasn't going to have time to do both.
Let me interrupt you. I apologize for interrupting, but I would just want to clarify for the audience. So 2022, how much did you do about in gross sales?
About 300,000, somewhere in there.
Majority of that was part-time. You were doing that while you were working a couple of other jobs.
Yes.
And then in 2023, you decided, hey, listen, I'm going to go in all in on this again. I got enough confidence. I've got some customers. And then that's when you jumped in full-time in early 2023 and you did it full-time. What did you do in revenue in 2023?
600, somewhere in there.
So you more than doubled the business, right? Mm-hmm. All right, cool. And then in 2024, let's tease people a little bit because we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But in 2024, what were your sales in 2024?
Did right at 1.225 million, somewhere in there.
So look at this, 300,000 part-time, 600,000 his first year full-time, and then 1.25 million. He doubled every year for the first few years, starting part-time. This is what I want you guys to understand. I understand that not everybody is in a position where they can jump into this full-time. But the point is that where there's a will, there's a way. That's the reason why I wanted to have Mike on here, because when he told me his story about how he jumped in full-time and really didn't have as much success as he thought, he had to kind of backtrack a little bit and then relaunch part-time, and then eventually he was able to have enough success. The key lesson here is this: what a lot of people would have done, and Mike and I talked about this before we jumped on, is that when he got some resistance early on, right, and he had to go back to those full-time jobs, what would most people have done at that point, Mike?
Walked away.
They'd have quit. They'd have hung it up. They'd have said, I tried it. It didn't work, and they'd have made some sort of excuse. That's what most people do. I mean, we've all done it, right? Mike didn't do that. He dug back in. I'm sure he was a little disappointed, but he had also built enough confidence because he had moved some loads. And so that's one of the lessons I want you guys to take from this. Okay. So let's jump into a little bit more depth here. Okay. So how did you balance the part-time with the full-time, right? Because you had at least one full-time job, maybe more, and you were doing this part-time. How did you balance all that? Talk to us a little bit about that, because I think that's where people need to connect the dots, and it'll be a little bit different for everybody, but how did you navigate?
So I think the biggest thing for me, part-time as a freight broker is still full-time. And it sounds dumb to say, but you need to be available whenever somebody reaches out to you. That's what I have found with just sales in general, but especially in the freight business, is that you need to be willing to jump when somebody is. So that means if it's 8 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock at night, you need to get back to somebody. So you can't, for me at least, and I don't think that it would work for other people, is you can't just have your full-time job from just say 8 to 5, 9 to 5, and then do your freight brokerage from 5 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night and then shut it off again. You got to be available all the time. So there's a little bit of conflict of interest there, obviously, depending on what your full-time job is. If you're doing other things during that full-time job, I was working remote and it was a performance-based job basically. So was able to do both throughout the day when emails would come in or calls would come in, which is not a lot when you're starting. You get excited when you get an email or a phone call asking for a rate for something because it gives you something to do, but that's when you need to be available to do it. So I think that's the main thing. And then after your 8 to 5 or 9 to 5, taking some admin time to figure out, okay, when I have time during the day, what am I going to be doing? That way you can actually be proactive during the day, or you can be working instead of putting a plan together. Because at nighttime, there's not going to be a whole lot going on, relatively speaking.
Yeah. So you had a remote sales job that you were working from home. That was your primary gig. That was what was mainly paying the bills.
Yes.
And then simultaneously, you were spending time reaching out to shippers and learning the industry and figuring out your niche and, developing carrier relationships and doing the fundamentals, the things that you need to do. You kind of touch first base, right?
Yes.
And so that was how you navigated. So let me tell you, what was the biggest challenge during that time? I mean, what was the biggest issue? What was the biggest hurdle to overcome, in making that transition from part-time to full-time?
Probably just once you get a little bit of traction, trying to balance both. And it's one of those things where you've got an obligation to your full-time person that's paying the bills. You want to make sure that you're being fair to them, that you give them a full 2 weeks, that you're holding up your end of the deal on that. But when you start getting busy with your own thing, you got to obviously pay attention to that too. So it gets to a point where it's pretty tough to balance as far as making sure that you're not slacking on one side or the other. My boss was really awesome as far as, I was transparent with them. They knew that I was trying to start my own business, and just having open communication with them about what I wanted to do long term. And they were supportive. If there were days when I was busy just because there was stuff that was going on, I'd tell them, hey, I need some extra time. Can I not be clocked in during this these couple hours so I can knock out some things for the business. But that was the hardest part, I guess, is just trying to, when you got two legitimately full-time jobs and you're really busy, trying to fit it into one day doesn't work. So basically delegating and figuring out what you need to do when.
Yeah, trying to juggle a lot of different balls, especially when there's really no connection between the two, right? You got a job and you got a business and they're not the same thing. You got a family and you've got your health and you've got all those other issues, right? So it's definitely hard to juggle those. Even when you're working full time, it's hard to juggle all those, let alone multiple full-time jobs and a business as well. So I can only imagine. So here's a question for you. We touched on it a few minutes ago, but I don't want to gloss over it. Was there ever a time when you considered quitting?
Oh yeah, often. It's frustrating. Like I said, you legitimately get excited when an email would come in. I mean, I remember I wouldn't get an email for it'd be a week or longer. There'd be no emails that would come in besides just some spammy, TMS email or something that I had reached out to. So yeah, I mean, it's not for the faint of heart. Definitely doable. Consistency is the main thing, I would say. Just continuing to try and put things together, trying to learn things, and being willing to make changes too. You can have a plan and think that it's going to work out. All right, I'm going to work in this industry and these are the lanes I'm going to run, but you need to have some flexibility to make it work, because that may not be the timing for that niche or that lane for whatever reason, because things are really competitive. So you got to be willing to make changes.
All right, good. That makes total sense. So let me navigate over to this, because you talked about it briefly when you introed yourself and you started talking about your niche. So how did you find your niche? Because I know you tried a couple of things when you first started. How did you find it, and why did you make the decision to go all in on that niche?
I feel like it's kind of both. I didn't necessarily find it. Maybe it kind of found me too. I had tried doing steel initially, which is very competitive, and
just straight flatbed loads, right?
Just regular flatbed loads, legal loads. The reason that attracted me was there's a lot of freight that's there, and that's the problem, is there's a lot of freight that's there. So I was given the opportunity to bid on a lot of freight. I think if I maybe won one or two loads, that it was a nightmare to get covered, just because it was such a competitive quote that was provided. So I was familiar with equipment from being on the construction side a little bit and some agriculture stuff. So I guess the vibe of that, as silly as that sounds, for the shippers and just what it is, the product, I was familiar with it. So able to make some connections, and I guess more so connect with the people that are shipping that equipment probably as well.
So let's talk a little bit about that, kind of how it evolved. You do a lot of, like you said, open deck loads, and it's a lot of farm equipment.
Yep. Farm equipment, construction equipment, anything open deck. I kind of joke that can't be broken easily. So, head machines, skid steers, attachments for excavators, farm equipment, sprayers and combines, implements being planters and all kinds of stuff. So the construction stuff, a lot of that is oversized, overweight, heavy, big, bulky stuff. The farm stuff, a lot of it is bulky, but not as heavy. So they kind of parallel on, you need to do permits for some of that stuff. Less than, hot shot, if it be a partial load for, a little lawnmower or something like that, I do that too. So pretty much a little bit of everything from hot shot all the way up to, oversized, overweight, 120,000 pound machines plus.
All right. So now that you've kind of identified that niche, what has been the best strategy or tactic that you've used in order to acquire new customers? And maybe you could tell us a story about a customer and how it evolved, right?
Yeah.
Maybe how you got a customer, and it just kind of a unique, interesting story, how that happened, and try to enlighten the audience a little bit into how you're getting customers early on and maybe how that's evolved.
So early on was a lot of cold prospecting or maybe warm prospecting, just seeing what the locations are. A lot of the ones that I'm dealing with are relatively small. The biggest thing and the biggest switch for me last year was referrals, 100%. And that's one thing about the trucking industry, I'm assuming as a whole, but especially with the open deck stuff and even with my customer bases, you think that it's this giant network and that nobody knows anybody and that everybody's a stranger because it's a wide open roads out there across the country. A lot of these people know each other. A lot of these people talk. So if you can do a good job with a customer, they'll spread the word to who their customer was. If it's a shipper at a business, they'll spread the word to their customer, who's Mr. Farmer. And then Mr. Farmer is going to call you when he's not buying a piece from that other customer that was mine. So now I've earned another customer out of that. And then he's telling his buddy in town who owns the other 100 acres across town who needs the same piece of equipment that he just got for the same circumstances. And then my number's getting passed around again. So it's a very much, through the grapevine kind of deal, which takes time. I don't do a whole lot of prospecting now, honestly. Last year, I was doing a decent amount at the first of the year still, but stuff's kind of leveled out to the point where I don't have quite as much time to do that. So I'm mostly just focused on trying to really take care of the customers at a high level, quick communication, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I love that. But one thing that we left out, and I think is really important when you talked about your niche, you do, farm equipment, you do stuff, open deck stuff, and you're dealing with farmers and equipment dealers and people that are probably buying and selling from auctions and who knows where else, maybe maybe they're selling on Facebook Marketplace or whatever the case may be. But one thing that you did that we talked about before we jumped on here was you kind of focused more in your local geography, right? You focused a little bit more local. You didn't try to be everywhere. Like, you're not moving loads from Seattle to San Diego, right? I mean, you're moving stuff. You're in North Carolina. So when you just said that about, trying to get in those referrals and trying to build that network, it's a lot easier to build that network where people know people and they're willing to refer when it's in your local market, because again, they're more likely to know people that likely to know people in that local area that need help, right? So talk to us a little bit about that. Why did you decide to niche it down into that local geography? What was it, just happenstance, or is that just kind of how you got traction, or was there some sort of strategy behind it?
A little bit of both. So the Northeast is tough, in my opinion, when it comes to permitting and stuff. If you just look at the map of the United States, I've got a map over my head over here, which is why I'm looking at it. But like the Northeast, for example, above the Mason-Dixon line, somewhere in there, stuff's really tight as far as the states. They're a lot smaller. They're a lot closer together. You got the big cities. Permitting and everything is very expensive up in there. You get down to the south, moving west, southwest, states are bigger. The overall costs for moving equipment are much cheaper, relatively speaking. And then, of course, relatively speaking, probably once you get north of Virginia, there's not as many farms that are going to be up that way. It's a lot more populous with the cities and everything. Down in the south, obviously, you've got, more agriculture stuff that's going on. And then obviously moving west over toward Texas, which that's kind of my zone, I guess, from, Virginia over to Kansas down to Texas kind of thing down in there. That's how it started. I did do a lot of outreach through local marketplaces and things like that for people trying to sell things, just to try and get my name out there. Like I said, everything's connected. I didn't realize it as much at that point in time that people would talk to people, but that's another way that you can try and just put another feather in your hat or try and get your name in front of somebody.
Yeah, for sure. As we kind of wrap this up here, okay, I want to ask you one more important question, and this is always the hard one. Right? If you had to start all over today, knowing what you know now, what are 2 or 3 things that you might do different?
That's really tough. I'm one of those people that everything happens for a reason. I think that, the struggles and the stuff that I went through would push me and guided me into where I'm at now. I would definitely say, I honestly think that I had enough knowledge, relatively speaking. It's one of those things, the lingo and the terminology and the conversations, they get a lot easier the more that you do them, obviously. But you can't have those conversations without having them, without getting the work and being able to do it. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. I would say maybe just get a little bit more insight. Even talking to drivers, that's the hard thing. If you talk to drivers, it's a totally different perspective than if you talk to shippers, which is going to be totally different perspective than if you talk to a broker. There's just, everybody's got their own opinions. I probably honestly wouldn't do anything really different. One thing that I didn't mention to you, or we didn't really talk about, that I maybe would do different, and you talk about this, which is kind of a no-no in your book. I have tried to hire a couple agents along the way. That was one thing that I looked at when I was failing. I'm like, all right, I got to hire somebody to kind of keep my ship floating here. And it really hasn't worked out. I've got one that's working for me now, but none of this has to do with him. The point being is that you need to be the one that does the work. You need to put in the time and you need to figure it out. And that's the only way it's going to work. And then from there, you can help your agents or whoever else is going to help you.
Yeah, I love that. That's a really good point, because I get that question all the time. There's a misconception out there that you can just go get your broker authority, go hire a bunch of agents, and they're going to build your business for you. And that's just not real. Nope. Okay. You're probably more likely to buy a lottery ticket and win than for that to work. Yep. So what you have to do is you have to learn the business. You got to do the business. You got to build the business. You got to learn all of the steps of that business. When I did my business, I was the chief cook and bottle washer. I emptied garbage. I made sales calls. I posted loads. I did invoices. I collected bills. I did it all. And eventually we kind of migrated and built a team, but I did not hire my first agent for 3 full years of operations. I think we were doing somewhere between 6 and 10 million in sales before I hired my first agent, because by that time I had processes in place. Yep. I had operating procedures. I had a brand. I had good credit. I had good cash flow. I had a real business. Right. And then so I could package that up and create an agent program that I could offer to the marketplace as a product in a partnership type format. Even then it didn't go according to Hoyle, right? We made a ton of mistakes and we struggled for a bit, but we stuck with that agent model, and fortunately it grew. And now the company, I mean, I sold the company in 2016, but that company now did 450 million in 2024.
Yeah.
So that model can work, but it's not a get rich quick, here's the secret to success, get your authority and hire a bunch of agents, right? There's a lot of nuances in there. I'm so glad that you realized early on that you needed to get your hands dirty and you need to dig in and you needed to learn that business. And the people that don't learn that, they really struggle.
That's kind of maybe going back to to give something that I would change is probably the mindset. It's hard because it's even, you've got a handful of students that have done really well, really early, built big businesses. And that's something I say it all the time. Talk is cheap. You look on the internet, you look on Facebook, you look on all these social platforms. And that's why a lot of people get into the freight industry, I think, is it's like, look, you're going to make all this money so fast and you're not going to have to do anything. There's lots of potential there for a business, obviously. But, I think that maybe I was a little hard on myself, had a little bit of false expectations maybe, or thought, hey, I should do 1.5 million my first year. Why am I only doing 300 or, whatever it is. So
right.
I don't know, little steps, and the baby steps turn into strides pretty quick.
One of the main reasons why I thought having you on here was so important is the fact that it took you time. You had a lot of obstacles. You had a lot of opportunities to quit. You didn't. But after 3 years now, look where you are, right? Now, look where you are today. And so it doesn't always happen fast, right? I have a lot more students who struggle their first 6 months, their first 6 to 12 months, than I have students that come out of the cannon and, do $10,000 in profit their first month. I mean, I have students that have done that. I've got plenty of students that have done that, but that's not the norm. So I'm glad you mentioned that because it does take time. It's not a get rich quick. Everybody loves to watch those videos because those are really motivational and nobody wants to hear the hard parts. But the reality is there's a lot more guys like Mike. But here's the good news. Mike survived and he's on the other side. Now he's got a real business. And I mean, just based on having a short conversation with him, I think the sky's the limit. So I'm super excited for you. And listen, Mike, why don't you share if somebody wants to connect with you? I know you're on LinkedIn a little bit. I know you do probably have a little bit of time for social media, and maybe talk a little bit about your company if somebody wants to reach out to you, whether they be another broker or carrier or shipper or whatever it is, and then we'll jump into some Q&A.
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. Michael Barmashi is the name. MBF Logistics, M as in Mike, B as in boy, F as in Frank Logistics. That's the business name out of Waxhaw, North Carolina, Charlotte area. You can get me there. I've got a website as well, just a basic website like Dennis recommends, mbflogisticsllc.com. There's a contact form on there. I'll be glad to try and, if you get questions or anything like that, I'll be glad to try and help you out.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it. Congratulations on all your success. And so we'll jump into some Q&A.
Thanks, Dennis.